Penguin Random House Canada presents NISHGA by Jordan Abel. Read for you by John Wamsley, with Cody Caetano, Sachiko Murakami, Ellora Patnaik, Niigaan Sinclair, Tara Skye, and Caleb Stull, with an introduction written and read by David Chariandy.
For the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas. A note about the cover art. At some point during the writing of NISHGA, it became really important to me to put my work in conversation with my dad's artwork. I wasn't sure what the result would be when I started this process, but on reflection, I see it as a moment where I could attempt to learn, to think through, and to exist with the shapes and contours of his work. Perhaps the process was even an imperfect way to understand Nisga'a art forms and knowledge. This is a process that I have continued beyond the scope of NISHGA, and it is a process that fills me with hope and joy. If you look close enough at this particular piece, you can see my dad proudly displaying t-shirts printed with his designs. Jordan Abel.
Introduction by David Chariandy. NISHGA is for the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, a dedication that reminds us that books arise from specific contexts, summoning particular readers able to offer the most urgent and knowing interpretations. But great literature may also reach the minds and hearts of others, and it is in the latter circumstance that I offer this introduction, writing as someone who has sought to read this book with due humility and care, and also as someone who has been honored to witness certain stages of its creation. As its author both states and cautions, NISHGA is about intergenerational trauma, Indigenous dispossession, and the afterlife of residential schools. There is no pretense that this book could be otherwise, no avoidance of what some misguided educators might cast as unduly upsetting materials. Within the first few pages, we encounter John A. MacDonald, whose stated desire to eradicate the habits and training and mode of thought of Indigenous peoples represents not only the sentiment of a political leader, but that of a nation. We also read Duncan Campbell Scott, a writer once celebrated for his poetry about the so-called vanishing Indian, who, in his official capacity as Deputy Superintendent General of the Department of Indian Affairs, describes the deadly residential schools as part of a final solution of our Indian problem. We are reminded of the enduring links between political rhetoric, cultural representation, and genocidal policy. But if NISHGA does not shrink from naming both the sources and cascading effects of historical trauma, neither does it proffer naked spectacles of suffering. Instead, to a striking degree, NISHGA presents documents. It reproduces the handwritten sheet of graph paper on which the author's mother has written necessary contact information for the Vancouver Police Department, for the Native Women's Sexual Assault Center, and for the Victoria Women's Transition House. It offers affidavits and other legal documents attesting to a family broken by domestic violence and sexual assault. It reproduces excerpts from a yellow Province of British Columbia pamphlet titled Confidentiality and the Family Court Counselor, but also from Honoring the Truth, Reconciling for the Future, Summary of the Final Report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Even the author's own words and reflections are represented as documents, his thoughts and analyses at academic occasions reproduced as time-stamped transcripts, his most subtle and private recollections rendered as notes. The selecting and positioning of these documents is intensely purposeful, mirroring the author's own investigations into his past, while also illuminating how history dialogues with the present, how individuals are bound up in broader social forces, and how the deep legacies of Indigenous dispossession contribute ineluctably to the pain and bitter fractures of today. But Nisga'a also shows us just how often its author has had to face the ignorant assumptions, projections, and judgments of others. One person asks about the author's blood quantum, while another confidently informs him that Nisga'a people no longer really exist. Others automatically assume that the author grew up in Nisga'a territory, or that he knows the Nisga'a language, demanding thereafter to know why not. The very title of the book, NISHGA, marks yet another judgmental encounter, during which it was suggested that the author's mispronunciation of Nisga'a was proof of his cultural inauthenticity. Reproduced as the book's title, NISHGA is in fact a bold commitment to truth, an insistence upon personal and social realities that evidently require broader acknowledgement. It is a title that for Abel companions a crucial question. What does it mean to be indigenous if your relationship to community has become severed somehow? Nisga's narrative and poetic form is itself a full answer to this question, but I am struck too by how its author feels compelled to reflect consciously upon his goals and practices as a writer. Relatively early in the book, Abel explains how, in his desire to connect with Nisga'a culture, he went to the library and found the book Totem Poles by the ethnographer Marius Barbeau. What Abel understands as a deeply distorted colonial representation of Nisga'a knowledge and Nisga'a worldviews was, all the same, the first imperfect glimpse he had into Nisga'a culture. Unable to passively absorb or accept Barbeau's writing, Abel explains how he went to work on Totem Poles, producing through poetic erasures his own book entitled The Place of Scraps, a book that holds his experience and position as both an intergenerational survivor of trauma and as an urban indigenous person, and also holds his dismantling of colonial authority. Later in Nisga'a, Abel illuminates his decision to perform a different type of creative operation upon another colonial text, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. Abel explains how his overwriting of the classic Western can both illuminate how this colonial writing has shaped and continues to shape us, while also re-articulating indigenous presence. Abel's full work upon The Last of the Mohicans would of course become the acclaimed novel Empty Spaces. In the print edition of Nisga'a, Abel's writing becomes strikingly framed or inlaid with his father's own artwork. This collaborative art remains for me an exceedingly powerful and compelling aspect of the book, raising deep questions about the influence and malleability of the colonial archive, the interplay between literature and visual art, and the very limits of reading. In the audiobook, these images have been transformed into soundscapes, using parts of Empty Spaces as well as sounds representing both his parents, recast and shaped by the author's father's artwork. Here, I would simply underline that Abel seeks to distinguish his work from the inability of certain forms of conceptualisms to engage politically. NISHGA is a book whose necessary engagement with the world does not compromise its creative attention to form, but, of course, demands it. And yet it remains a book that has the courage to speak in direct personal terms. Abel reveals that from an early stage in the composition of this book, he understood that it was important to me to put my own work in dialogue with my dad's work, and that he possibly desired to create these moments of textual dialogue because, in life, there were no equivalent moments. For me at least, this is one of the most moving aspects of NISHGA, illuminating how the discordant forces of history, culture, and politics tunnel into the possible and impossible relationship of a son with his lost father. I must confess that my own reflections on NISHGA are not only specific and limited, but also unavoidably personal. I would
Sample complete. Ready to continue?